Hi, I'm Mary Jo Webster. This session is how to bulletproof your data analysis and your story that uses that analysis. So we'll start with the concept of bulletproofing a story is often synonymous with the idea of fact checking, which is usually done at the very end, sometimes even after all the editing has been done. But when you're doing your own data analysis for a story, this bulletproofing has to take place right from the beginning and continue all the way to the end. And the reason, and here's why. If you don't do some of the bulletproofing steps in the beginning, it might be like you're in the game of chutes and ladders, where you suddenly hit one of those long chutes and you end up way back where you started. So the advice I've got here today should help you avoid those chutes and instead land on the ladders to help move the story along. The possibility of something going wrong can occur anywhere along the process, and it could even be a problem with the data that you get right from the start, or it could be a problem you accidentally introduced during the analysis, or it could be problems in how you present your findings in the story. So we're going to talk about the various things to do at each step. Okay, so let's talk about your data first. The bottom line is that your data will have flaws. Some will be minor, some might be detrimental. The key is that you have to find them before they find you. I promise you that they will find you at some point. So we need to think about data as this kind of like an anonymous source who wants to be a whistleblower. You're really excited to hear what he or she has to say, but you need to remain skeptical until you've vetted them and checked out what they have to say. And so that's how you should treat data right from the beginning, always, no matter what data it is. So that first step really then is making sure you understand the data's backstory. How is it collected? How often is it updated? Does anybody review it for accuracy? Think about that analogy to the anonymous source whistleblower. Your first job is to figure out, who is this person? How did they get this information? Do they really have this information? All those same kinds of things apply here. You also want to understand, how does the agency use it? Do they generate some reports from it? Those reports could be useful for you to understand the data. I've found some agencies use their data basically, it's like, let's just put this information in a filing cabinet. We're required to keep it, and that's all. We don't really do anything with it. Those can often be problematic because the agency doesn't even really know what they have in there. But if they are doing their own analysis from it regularly, you've got some idea of what's possible from the data based on what they're doing with it. The same thing would be, if you can find others who have used the data, that might be journalists, that might be academics, might be other experts in the field. And then something that's you don't always think about, but what's not included in this data? What does this data not know about? So, for example, Minnesota has a crash database of car accidents. Well, it doesn't include every car accident. It's only those with a fatality or an injury or a certain amount of property damage over a certain threshold. So you can't really say it's every crash. I once needed to get licenses for all the turkey farms in Minnesota because of an avian flu outbreak. And we discovered that the license data wouldn't really tell us how many turkey farms there were in Minnesota and where they all were, because you had to have a certain number of turkeys in order to be required to have a license. So again, it wasn't everybody in there. We saw this a lot with COVID. Did the testing data we were seeing coming from the state, did that include all the tests run by the state and any private labs that were doing testing, or was it only the state public labs? We had questions like that throughout the pandemic about what we were seeing and what was there and what was not there. So you'll see this with almost every data set. There might be something that's not there, and you especially want to suss out, is the thing I really need there? So let's talk about an example. I'd call this worst case example. Janet Roberts, who is currently the head of the Reuters data team, she told me this tale about data she worked with while she was at the New York Times. She was looking at a story about the influence of drug companies paying doctors for speaking engagements and whatnot. Minnesota at that time was really the only state that was requiring doctors to report that they, or was it the insurance company, or the prescription, the pharmaceutical companies to report which doctors they had paid, and so that data was available in Minnesota. So she also got Minnesota Medicaid prescription data, and she was hoping to identify the top doctors who prescribed antipsychotic medication to children and compare that list to these drug company payments to doctors. And after they had had the data for a while, she was looking at it, and she was really noticing some really strange things. That, for example, an ophthalmologist way up in northern Minnesota was prescribing antipsychotics to a kid was hundreds of miles away in Minneapolis, an ophthalmologist prescribing antipsychotics, right? And then there's the geography problem here. And then the same patient was getting prescriptions for the same drug from different doctors in very erratic patterns. Janet started to inquire about how the data were collected, and eventually it came to light that there was somebody, clerks who were taking your prescription were typing in the name of the doctor, and they were basing that sometimes on the signature of the doctor, not a printed name. And obviously they got it wrong. And this is a case where the data then became useless for her. She couldn't use it. Now that's a worst case scenario. I'll show you some others that are a little less worst case. Probably the most common thing you'll see in data is what is known as, this is most commonly called dirty data, but really it's just inconsistent values where a single field that is supposed to have something in it, such as the picture here with city names, where the city is supposed to be spelled out, but you see it in 5, 10, 20, 30 different ways, and it's very inconsistent. Any computer program, no matter what one you're using, if you try to group those values together and say, how many are in Minneapolis? In this case, the computer will see 2 because there's only 2 spots where Minneapolis is actually spelled properly. So that's something that has to be cleaned up before you can do anything with it. The other thing might be if there's too many blank or null values in a particular column. So, for example, I worked with a data set in Kansas looking at leaking underground storage tanks, and there was a field that indicated the reason for the leak. And I was really excited about this because this was a key part of my analysis. I wanted to see what these leaks were being caused by, and if it was, there's a long story, but what the reason was, and I thought this will be great. Well, I opened up the data, and only probably less than 10% of the records had a value in that field. And the agency told me that it's just so hard to figure out the reason for the leak that they rarely fill it out. And so again, that particular column became useless to me, and I couldn't use it. The rest of the data set was fine. It was just that one column. Another thing you might have is just missing data in general. So for this story, the reporter wanted to track down how many people, like the woman in this picture, who had been injured or killed when they were bystanders to a high-speed police chase. It turns out the state's investigative agency requires law enforcement agencies to report any chases to them, and including a lot of details, including some details about these bystanders, whether they were injured or killed, and who all was involved, and things like that. We got a copy of the data set and started analyzing it, and we were finding that, we found a lot of bystanders, and we knew we had a story here. But then one day the reporter asked me to find a particular incident that she had written about. So, she knew it should be in the data set, and it wasn't there. And then another day she was talking to a law enforcement agency about a different incident, and that the data set had said nobody was killed, but the law enforcement agency, their report showed that somebody had been killed. And it turns out that the data we had was wrong in that regard. So we set out to try to do a mass review of the data. And we first looked at all the media reports in the state of any high-speed chases, and we made sure all of those incidents were in the data set. And then we did a random sample of the cases and went and pulled law enforcement records from various jurisdictions on those incidents to see if the information we had in the data set was correct. Luckily, we didn't find any additional problems beyond that. So we decided that we were safe to go ahead. But then we also wrote a methodology with the story explaining the problems we had found and how we vetted it, and some comments from the state agency about why there might be missing data in here. So our story, and this is common with a lot of data journalism stories. Usually we can only say at least this many things have happened, or at least this many bystanders were injured or killed, because we often can't be 100% certain that everything is there. But we did our best to try to find any additional flaws as best we possibly could, short of going through every single record. Usually that's impossible, but we did something. So another, there might also just be other errors in your data set, and this is where I kind of think about I call it the too good to be true problems. Sometimes you'll see something in a data set and you're like, whoa, that's amazing, there's a story here. Those are a red flag to step back and take a hard look. So this data set came from the Minneapolis Public School District. There was more to it. There was records for every school in the district, showing that how chronic absenteeism had changed over time. And the reporter found this one school where the chronic absenteeism rate had dropped from relatively high, 15, 20%, down to suddenly 5% from in 1 year. And the editors were all excited. It was going to be an important, page one story, and this feel-good story about this school district that had turned it around. And the editors asked her to get data on other school districts beyond Minneapolis. And to do that, she had to go to the state. And the state had different data. They measure chronic absenteeism differently. It's based on the number of days you're absent over a certain period of time. And their measurement is just different than Minneapolis. And so the numbers from Minneapolis were different than what she had gotten from the Minneapolis School District. But it was still puzzling to her that this 5% here, something was not adding up for her. And she kept pressing the school district, and she pressed the state. Eventually, the school district reran the numbers for her and came back, with their tail between their legs, apologizing that they had screwed up and that 5% was not correct, that it really had not fallen. I think it was still at 15%. And the story hit the cutting room floor. We couldn't do it. But it was great that reporter kept asking questions and pushing them to double check those numbers. Some more agency screwed up problems. I was working with a reporter on the diversity in teaching staff, and we suddenly noticed that in this one particular year, all the schools in the St. Paul Public School District, unlike any other district in the state, by the way, were suddenly at like 95, 100% teachers of color. And, at first glance, this is a little bit of that too good to be true problem as well. There's like, wow, this is amazing. What did St. Paul do to turn it around? But something gnawed at me. And so I pulled up, so here's that year we were looking at, and I just pulled up a single year and the breakdowns that they'd provided us. This is in FTE numbers. So it was saying that nearly 95 FTEs were, or the percent, I guess 95% of the FTEs were Native American, and only 5% were white. And so then I was like, well, I wonder what this school looked like the year before. Here's the year before. Almost all white, very little Native American. And so what happened is we reached out to the agency we got the data from, and they reached out to St. Paul Public Schools. It turns out that St. Paul had inverted the white and the Native American numbers, and they'd accidentally reported them in the wrong bucket. And once we got the correct data, there was really no change in St. Paul. And like all the other districts, they're just predominantly white. Okay, so those are, hopefully those things don't scare you away, that those are all kind of some pretty bad scenarios. But hopefully you see that you need to go looking for those flaws in your data before you get going. So now when you've figured out your flaws, you've figured out your limitations, you've done maybe some data cleanup, now it's time to do some analysis. So here we're going to talk mostly about some best practices that will avoid additional problems. So first of all, make a copy of the data you got from the agency, stash it away in a safe place, ideally something like a cloud server, not on your desktop where it could possibly crash and burn if your computer dies, and probably keep it separate from your analysis work. So like almost put it in a safe. Also, just don't delete things in your data. There's in spreadsheets or any other program, there's ways to hide things or just kind of tuck them out of your way, but don't actually delete because you might come to regret that later. This is a huge one, keeping a data diary. So data diaries can look very, very different from person to person, and depending on whether you're coding or with R or Python, or if you're using Excel or SQL, but you want some way to keep track of each step of your analysis, especially the data cleaning, and especially spots where you're making choices. Perhaps you're choosing to filter down to a certain set of records instead of doing your analysis on everything. This is also a good place to log your questions and then the answers you get after you go hunting for the answers. So it should be written in a way that someone else could come through and read it and be able to follow what you did with your data and be able to bulletproof it, help you bulletproof it. And we're going to talk about that later, but that is a crucial thing that would help you in the long run. This is time consuming, doing a data diary, and it's really easy to get lost in your analysis and forget to write things down and then not feel compelled to write things down. And I'm guilty of this many times over, but it does help a lot, especially when you're just getting started. Assume nothing. Don't make any assumptions about the meaning of values in the data set or why something might be missing. Really simple example is, especially a long time ago when computer space was expensive and rare, agencies would often have a gender column where the values would be either 0 or 1. Well, which one's male and which one's female? You need code books to tell you what that code is. You don't want to just assume which one is which. And you know, I learned over the years that 0 and 1, most agencies did 0 for male and 1 for female. But what if that one did it differently than the other agencies, and your assumption would be wrong? So, just if you're not sure what something means, or why something might be missing from your data set, or something that looks, at all strange, you need to contact the agency and ask those questions. If you can't get an answer to it, then that information becomes useless to you because you're not sure what it is. Lean on sources and experts. You should be talking to somebody else about your data, not just your editor or your senior fellow or whoever you're working with, but the place you got the data from, people who are experts in the topic you're writing about, even if they're not the keepers of the data, but they understand the topic. Those people are going to be better situated to answer questions for you about what something means, help you determine if your findings look normal or abnormal, or if there's something you should be concerned about. You also want to make sure the people that you're quoting in your stories, especially the ones that are responding to whatever trend or pattern you have found in the data, you want to make sure they've seen your data and that they think that looks about right. Even if they haven't done the analysis before, they should be an expert enough on the topic to know that if you found something like 30% of something, 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 that they should be able to tell you, yeah, that sounds like the right number, or that sounds really low, or that sounds really high. Any red flags from sources like that would be a reason for me to go back and check my analysis, go redo things, talk to that person some more about how something might have gone wrong. Sometimes those reports that government agencies issue have summary statistics in them that could help you cross-check your work. Maybe it's just confirming that you have the right totals in your data. Like, let's say you have a data set of every foster home placement, and the summary stats show you that there were 205 foster placements in the calendar year that you're looking at, and your data set is one row for every foster care placement, then you should have 205 rows of data. You should make sure those two things kind of line up. If you're doing something unique that's never been done before, like you're building your own database or anything that someone hasn't done a report on, this will be a little bit harder, but there's usually something that you can find that kind of you can help check yourself with. Okay, so a big one is reviewing your methodology choices. You're always going to have to make decisions that will affect the answers you ultimately put in your story. These might be simple decisions like whether to use a raw number or some kind of rate, or it might be something more complicated. And so we're going to go through some examples that kind of get at some of these things here. So the most simple decisions are probably going to be whether to use a raw number or a rate. And then if you're using a rate, what's the denominator? Our 2021 fellow Edwin Rios had to face both of those decisions for this story about evictions during the pandemic. He wanted to show that evictions were hitting majority Latino neighborhoods harder than other neighborhoods. So first, should you use a raw number or a rate? That's a very hard and fast rule on that one. If you are comparing geographies that have different sizes of populations, you always use a rate. But then the harder part here was, what's the denominator? Edwin had his numerator was the number of housing units that faced eviction, but then what do you divide that by to get a rate? One thing you could do would be the number of rental housing units in that geography, but sometimes that's a hard one to get. A population figure is a little bit easier to get usually for different geographies. And so that's what he used, is the number of people living in those neighborhoods. And he had, making sure you include everybody, including the children. So, and make sure it's the same every neighborhood, you're using the same denominator. So figuring out what that denominator should be, or what, should it be a rate, is something where those sources and experts should be able to help you with. And you can always check with your senior fellow or other, this place you got the data from, perhaps some editors, about what makes the most sense for a denominator. The universe that you're going to cover. What records do you need out of the data set? How wide are you going to go? This is known as the universe. One of my fellows in 2020 wanted to use housing inspection data to find out how often inspectors were finding people living in unpermitted apartments, like a garage that hadn't been properly converted to a true rental space. The data he got was a very, very big file of every housing violation the department had issued for all kinds of things. You don't have a smoke detector. You don't have there's cockroaches in the house, things like that. But there wasn't, the agency didn't have a single like type of violation, like a unpermitted housing violation. That wasn't a thing. But there was a whole series of codes that violations that were often issued to an apartment if it was this kind of a situation, like an unpermitted situation. So he had to find all of these codes. Well, first of all, he had to ask the city, what code should I use? And they told him, they gave him a list, and then he had to filter his data down to those, just those codes. So this is super, super common thing that you're going to deal with, especially when you're dealing with detailed level data, not summary data, but that detailed level data like he did here. And the people who understand this topic are going to be way better at this than you. You don't want to just make a guess. You don't want to assume. Get some help to do it. Comparing things, like how should I show this is worse than other things? This is another one where you could easily get tripped up on. If you make the wrong choice, you might make it look worse than it really is, or you might make an unfair comparison. One of our 2022 fellows wanted to use the new federal price transparency data, which hospital insurance companies have to publish costs for various medical treatments. He wanted to figure out if, or be able to prove that mental health treatment was being paid at a much, much lower rate than other treatments. Well, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of treatments out there in that data. And so how do you make it a fair comparison and make it something that we can boil down a little bit for readers? And so he spent a lot of time talking to various experts about how that convoluted pricing system works, just so he understood it. And then he asked a lot of questions about how to find mental health care in there. They pointed him to this code for psychoses. And then what's the most fair way to compare to other things? Well, psychoses was one of the top, I think it's 20 or 25, top 20 most common codes used for payments in the data. And so he just decided to just use those top 20. And you can see that psychoses is at the bottom, just as he expected it would be. Sometimes we have to decide like how you're going to define something in the story. So in 2016, I worked on a story about racial segregation in schools in the Twin Cities. The reporter had been hearing anecdotally the schools in Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is those black areas in the map that you see scrolling around here, that they had resegregated despite efforts in the 1990s to desegregate. So we got enrollment data going back to the 1980s for all the elementary schools in the metro area. And then we needed to determine how to classify a school as segregated. What's that threshold? The state data did not have a field in there that said, this school is segregated, this school is not. But it had the number of kids broken down by their race and ethnicity. So we went to several experts and asked them, how do you define a school as being segregated? And many of them said if 75% or more of the students were students of color, or if 75% or more were white. So either of those two things. One of our most valuable experts told us, yeah, that 75 is used a lot, but if you want to be conservative, go with 80%. So that's what we did. We decided to go with 80%. And so we classified each school as if they went above that 80% threshold or not. So above the threshold, they were defined as segregated schools. So the orange dots in this map. And if not, we called them integrated schools, the green dots. And once we classified each school like this into these buckets, you could very, very easily see this change happening over time in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Ultimately, it comes down to this. Can you defend all of those decisions if someone calls you up after publication and asks you why you did something the way you did? I sometimes try, before publication, try writing a little methodology story. even early on in my analysis process, to try to just hear what my defense would be and to try to get it all out of my head. Sometimes that act of writing it down helps me to see my holes or my missteps or something that I forgot. I can also see whether my defense is just a long, convoluted mess or a nice and simple answer. And you really want nice and simple, because readers are not going to understand some convoluted thing. Well, we included these, but we didn't include these, and we chose to just only include some of these or something of that. Like those kinds of things you want to steer clear of. That's usually going to be a recipe for disaster. So you can also kind of probably imagine here that a poor decision on your methodology of what to include, what not to include, how to define things could be a detriment to your story in the long run. So this is a really crucial step here. All right, so before you say finish with that analysis, run it again from start to finish. If possible, try a different approach. If you're a little more advanced, maybe try a different software. Try starting from a different point. Try not to look back at what you did before, but try to just pretend like you're starting from scratch, and you might discover things you missed the first time. Have those experts weigh in. I've said that a couple times now. I'm going to say it again. Make sure those experts and your sources are reviewing those findings. Ask a colleague to review it. Now, yes, it would be great if you have someone with data skills who could look through your data diary and compare it to your data. Maybe they could even recreate your analysis and make sure you come up with the same things. But even if you don't have that, have an editor review your findings. Editors are sometimes good at having that gut check, like that really does not make sense, or there's a red flag here, or something like that. They should be able to have some good questions to throw back at you that might prompt you to rethink what you did or to catch some problems. Okay, so the final piece, what you actually put in your story, how you phrase it, how you display it in charts and maps. Wording is crucial. So even if we have all the right numbers, how we phrase a sentence could be problematic. This is a classic example that I stole from a great book called Damned Lies and Statistics. Highly recommend you read it. It's an old book, but very good. So the author had come across this mentioned in one of his students' dissertations. So it's saying every year since 1950, the number of children gunned down has doubled. So in order to explain why this was wrong, he talked about how assume that one child was killed by a gun in 1950. If it was doubling each year, which is what that sentence was saying, then there would be two in 19. That would be 4 in 19. 2 in 1950. 4 in 1951. By 1965, it would have been 32,768. The author points out that that year, the FBI only identified about 9,000 homicides in the entire country. By 1983, it would be past 8 billion, which was twice the Earth's population at that time. So this, and if you charted it, this is what it would look like, doubling over time. So the real sentence was that the number of children killed each year by guns has doubled since 1950. So just one doubling across all those years. So when you're writing your story, and especially when you finish writing your story, go back and check every number that you've put in there. Treat these like we treat human quotes, double checking that you didn't get the words in the wrong order, that you've attributed it correctly. I've caught myself a couple of times where I wrote a number in a story from memory, so I'm writing along and I'm like, oh yeah, that number was X, and I was on a roll. So I would be writing, and then during the fact checking, I realized that I'd gotten it wrong in some way. maybe the entirely wrong number, or I attribute it to the wrong source, or I described it incorrectly. So make sure you go back. The other thing you want to make sure is that your numbers in your story match anything that you're putting in your visuals. So let's say in the story you round a number to 30%, and in the visual you're talking about 28%. You don't want to do that. You're going to, readers are going to catch that and probably call you up. I'm not going to spend much time on this because we have other sessions on visualizations, but I just want to point out that misleading or just plain wrong visualizations can also sink your story. So all the fact checking and bulletproofing you do for your story should also be done on your visualizations. Here's a more specific example about how charts can be misleading. The first chart on the top is showing law enforcement officers who were feloniously killed between 2008 and 2011. This implies, if you just look at that top chart, it implies that there's an upward trend, and maybe it would even lead readers to believe that things are getting really bad. But if you look at those years dropped into a much longer time span, which you'll see in the bottom chart, you'll see that 2011 was a weird blip of a year, and in reality, this number of officers killed is still very historically low. So there's, this context and thinking very carefully about how you're phrasing things also applies to visualizations. You'll have a copy of this slide deck. You can get these links. There's quite a few great things out there in the journalism world about bulletproofing, how to spot problems and pitfalls. And we will now take questions. Thank you.